Hi and welcome back to part 2 of this epic pond build. If you haven't seen part 1, check that out up here. At the end of part 1, the rain came down pretty hard and it did totally defeat me. The downpipe system worked better than I thought and it filled up the pond really quickly. It was a bit of a blessing in disguise though, because it did highlight some of the flaws in my plan, like this one.
Bite-sized garden.
In this video, I'm going to show you how to and how not to stack rock walls, and also show you why it's really hard to make a pond look natural without bigger rocks around the lip. You'll also see me continue to battle and lose against gravity and water. The downpipe system works really well at bringing the water in, but whatever I try, I just can't seem to manage to get that seal around the pipe working to stop the water draining back out again. But first, it was another trip to Bunnings. Overnight, I'd had serious reservations about the black plastic I'd used and its suitability as a pond liner. While picking up the extra hessian I needed, I noticed that Bunnings had a PVC pond liner that was almost twice as thick as the black plastic I used, so I decided to try that out. The first job was to go backwards, emptying out the pond, something I get pretty good at during this build. I'll try to rip through a lot of my mistakes as quickly as possible, and it's not because I'm trying to hide from them. On the contrary, I just don't want you to waste as much time discovering them as I did. What I'll do is I'll try and highlight them and then show you how to avoid them. Thankfully, it didn't take too long to clear out the stones, the sand, and pull up the black plastic. This PVC pond liner may be fine. It's certainly a lot cheaper than the EPMD I recommended in episode 1, but it's also about 1/3 as thick. So my advice would be to pay the extra and grab that EPMD at the start. The next job was to try and create a good seal around this inflow pipe. Not being a plumber or an engineer, I didn't really know what I was doing here, so I used quickset concrete in the hope that it would adhere to the plastic and the pipe and create a good seal. As you can see, I now had enough hessian to cover the whole pond liner. The rocks around the top help hold everything in place and also give you a good line to follow when you're trimming back the liner. You want about 15 to 20 centimeters, that's 6 to 8 inches, from the lip of the pond. Enough to mound up a little edge and then bury the rest in the surrounding soil. Again, the sand here is what I had read you should do. I'm still on the fence as to whether this is necessary. If anyone with more experience building ponds wants to give me their thoughts, please drop me a comment below. If nothing else, it does help the rocks nestle in a little bit better and hides the hessian. And it's also finally settled down in the finished pond too. As time goes on, I get better at this whole rock stacking thing. This is actually the second of 4 times I lay out these rocks. What am I doing wrong? Well, I'll tell you that in a minute, because this was the end of 3 days of hard labor and I really needed to take a break. At the beginning of day 4, I'd realized I'd forgot to put the pump in place at the bottom of the pond. I'd also forgotten to turn the GoPros on, so I don't have any footage of that. We pick up where I was yesterday, just with the addition of the pump in the deepest part of the pond, and I've put the rocks back in place over that. The pump won't do any filtration, but the water flow that it creates will aid aeration, which is pretty important in a natural pond like this. Otherwise, things tend to get a little stagnant. At this stage, I hadn't put a whole lot of thought into how the pump was going to operate aesthetically, and like most things with this build and many builds, it took me a few goes to properly nail it. In the last video, I mentioned trying to make your walls as vertical as possible. The reason for this is that it helps you stack the rocks on top of each other rather than laid out like tiles on a floor. The way I'm doing it here not only looks a little weird, it's also not very stable. If one rock slips out of place, then a whole lot can come tumbling down. Yeah, I discovered that firsthand. With a mighty sense of achievement, not yet dulled by reality, it was time to plant out around the pond. We had a couple of large agaves which I wanted to reposition and make a feature of, one at each end of the pond. Agaves are pretty hardy, so I didn't do too much in terms of soil prep. Just a little bit of seaweed fertilizer to ease transplant shock and also promote root growth, as well as some stakes to hold them up until the soil had settled a bit. Adding the irises I dug up and some smaller agaves around the base of the big ones really helped make it feel more natural. And as I said in part 1, the hope here is that these spiky plants will give lizards and frogs a bit of protection from birds and cats. It's fairly obvious from the high shots here that the pond still looks pretty unbalanced without any big rocks around the lip. At ground level it wasn't as noticeable, and I'd hoped it'd be even less so when it was full of water. Possibly wishful thinking on my behalf, but let's take a look. Very temporary bridge there. Hopefully the one that's coming will be a little bit more sculptural than that. Maybe. Yeah, you're probably feeling as underwhelmed as I was. I mean, Josh, where's that water coming from? With some big rain forecast, I decided to leave it for a few days to see if my downpipe inflow system would work. When the storm hit, it came down hard. The rain's absolutely smashing down. Thunder, lightning. I think I might take a break even though we're not close to filling up yet. And as you can see, the inflow worked a treat. Unfortunately though, almost as quickly as it flowed in, it flowed back out again. So after 5 days of work and a couple of weeks to let everything settle, I certainly had a pond, but it wasn't a pond that I was particularly happy with. The water system was working well, but the level just wouldn't get high enough. There was clearly some kind of leak going on around that inflow. And also the way the rocks were just so uniform, it just looked weird. I needed to get some bigger rocks to go around the lip, and thankfully my good mate Sonny had some from a sandstone wall that he'd just pulled down. I also had to fix up my walls to make sure that they didn't collapse every time a rock moved out of place. So another trip to Bunnings and a whole lot more rock moving for me. I probably should have just admitted defeat here and capped this downpipe, but I was determined to make it work. Yep, and if you're wondering, I really did regret that choice of t-shirt. I had sunburn on that spot for a week. So with a boatload of silicone, a double-ended clamped joiner, and some angled pipe, I got to work. While the silicone was drying, I set about moving the rocks so I could start restacking them properly. You can see by now I'm starting to get the hang of this rock stacking thing too. I'd got some smaller pebble-sized rocks which work really well as the base, and they look much better too. A little bit more silicone and it was time to connect up the inflow pipe. Another thing I wanted to try here was to create a bit of a waterfall. This meant I'd need to bury the pump hose and then build a dam wall so I could pump the water from the deeper end up to the smaller end and then have it flow back. Looking at the inflow system, I was pretty confident that I'd managed to seal it all up tight. It certainly looked the part. The only problem is, if there is a hole anywhere, water will find it. I used the leftover quickset concrete I had to start building the dam. Having not done anything like this before, I just started stacking rocks and hoping that they would hold enough of the water back and eventually act as a bit of a filtration system. It's fair to say that this ended up being a bit of a work in progress. The measuring I'm doing here is for the pond bridge I'm going to build that will step off our deck and onto what will eventually be a paved path. That video will be coming soon too, but unlike this build, it was actually really quick and easy. You can now see a little bit more clearly where I've put the smaller pebbles. They sit on the bottom and give a good foundation to start stacking from. As you'll no doubt agree, the layering here is looking so much better and the walls are much more stable too. I can climb in and out without fear of it collapsing on me, and I have a proper place to put the plants. Now for the moment of truth. Let's see how it looks when I fill it up with water. The pump is working well, sending the water up to the smaller end, but the dam wall is going to need a lot of work before it actually holds enough back to create any kind of waterfall. I try adding a bit of pond liner and that kind of works. So the next month goes by with me being pretty underwhelmed by this pond. There's lots of life in there, which bodes well for attracting frogs and lizards and other things that you need around the pond to make it truly a natural pond. I think the walls are working well, and it's nice to have the plants in there. And it's good to have a few of the bigger rocks around the top. Probably need a few more, but it is looking much nicer sort of in a design sense. The big thing that's bothering me though is the water level. No matter what I do, I just can't seem to get the level up past that inflow. The only time it got there was actually in that big storm when so much water was rushing in. I think it overwhelmed the drainage out and still managed to fill up. But I haven't been able to do that since, not with the taps or my rainwater. I've tried lots of things to sort of see what's working, but it's either got a leak there or there's a leak somewhere else. And yeah, I don't really know what to do. I did think it could be evaporation, but the water level was dropping so quickly, much more than you'd expect even on a really hot day. And it always seemed to stop dropping at the same point, right around the level of that inflow pipe. So where to now? Well, in the next episode, things finally come together. I get my hands on some proper EPMD pond liner. I rip everything out and I start again with that. I know a hell of a lot of work, but it's finally worth it. I do have a bit of a win though. I see some huge rocks at a construction site, and I trade a couple of 6-packs of beer for those. Everyone seems really happy with that. I finally work out how to make a proper waterfall and get that happening, and I even build a pond bridge. I will put those videos up here when they're all done, so perhaps hit that subscribe button if you want to see them, and even the little notification bell, that way you'll know when they come out. Until then, I hope everyone, you stay safe, and look forward to seeing you next time.